What is the challenge of life? The challenge of life is always not to do what we want to do. What does that mean? Because we are physical beings, our inclination usually is drawn after our physicality. And therefore, our physicality usually draws us to things which are contradictory to our spirituality. The only way our physicality within the physical has relevance to the spirituality, if it's invested in the spirituality, it's to facilitate the spirituality. Meaning, for instance, Shabbos, there's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, to enjoy the food, as we discussed. If a person eats and as a result of eating you don't feel well, the mitzvah is not to eat, because the Oneg is not to eat. So there's a mitzvah, or we have a mitzvah of V'shamachta b'chagecha, you should rejoice on your holiday. And the Gemara tells us, Ein simcha ela b'vasar v'yayin. How do we rejoice? With meat and wine. That's how we rejoice. So there we take our physical senses and we're utilizing them for the sake of a mitzvah, but it's within the context of physicality. Not to deny physicality, but just to benefit from the physicality, but within a context, I'm doing for the sake of a mitzvah. And there are other times where the challenge is, how do I allocate time? Do I allocate it for something which is unrelated to spirituality, or I invest it in spirituality, whatever it may be? But that's the challenge. And if you want to break it down to the barest level, do I use my ability for the sake of God or for my own sake? Is it for God's sake or is it for my sake? That's what it's all about. That's life. Those are the challenges of life. What usually is the cause of every sin? The cause of every sin is ego. Ego. Even if a person is an observant Jew, a very observant, there's always this whispering in our ear, we also have a right. I've studied enough, I also have a right. That's the ego. It's me because I. As much as you believe that things happen, even in a good context, because Hashem allows it to happen, but you believe, and we believe, we're a part of the equation. It's our intellect. The reason why we succeeded is because of this, that, although that's not the case. The Gemara tells us, one's yearly stipend, financial stipend, is determined on Rosh Hashanah. We all have to take initiative. But the reason why we actually are able to succeed to the degree we can is because that's already been allocated for us. Now the question is, when you go and you take the initiative, is it I, only me? Is it Hashem? And now I'm just going, by taking the initiative, it's the prerequisite to release whatever was allocated, or there's a partnership here. There's God and me. I also have something to do with it. It's just not a prerequisite, but I am part of the equation why it's happening. These are all the challenges. The Torah tells us at the beginning of creation, when Hashem made man, he says, let us make man b'tzalmud muso, in God's image and his form. Man was created b'tzelem Elokim. What is the tzelem Elokim? The image of a God. Who is God? God is the creator. God is the king of the universe. God is the all-powerful. That's who God is. We are created in his image. That means part of our persona as a human being is what? We dominate. The human being is the dominating creation, the only intelligible creation that walks the face of the earth. Man is the center of the universe. We're meant to dominate, to dictate, control. That's what a human being is all about. Now the question is, so because the human being is B'tzelem Elokim, as Hashem is Melech, as God is the king, the omnipotent one, in every sense of the word, the human being was created with that profile. Melech. The human being is the Melech. Now the question is, that could go one of two directions. The Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin that if two witnesses come to testify in a capital crime case, before they testify, before they interrogate them, they tell them, you realize that what's at stake here is a human life. And unless you're absolutely sure that what you saw was accurate, you should withdraw. Why? Because what is the innate value of a human being? When Hashem created Adam, he created him as a single individual. Every other living species was created as a pair. The human being was created as a single individual. Why? Because there's a message which is communicated. B'shvili nivra olam. When Adam came into being and he looked at this world, he said to himself, "This unlimited universe was created for me." B'shvili nivra olam. So what does that say? It says, evidently, if God created this universe for me, this little fickle being, evidently, the objective and my mission is unlimited, and therefore Hashem is providing all this in the world to facilitate what I'm meant to be, what I'm meant to actualize. That's one way to see it. That's Bishvili Nivra Olam. The other way to see it, which is the wrong side of the coin, Bishvili Nivra Olam. God created the world for me. It's for mine to control and dictate and to indulge it. So it's a two-sided coin. Is it B'shvili Nivra Olam? That only tells me the extent of my mission and my responsibility, what I'm meant to accomplish, or it means, no, B'shvili Nivra Olam is created for me. It's mine to take as much as I want, and even all of it. That's the challenge of human being. But what is that? B'shvili Nivra Olam. It's because the person has the persona of Melech to dictate and to utilize. That's the challenge. But every question is always, who am I? Am I the dominating force, or am I the what? The force who's meant to utilize and submit to Hashem. You know, we read on the Tisha B'Av, the Haftorah, which we read in the morning. The Navi says, "Lo Yisalel Gibor B'Gvuroso." A powerful person should not pride himself in his physical strength. Lo Yisalu Osher B'Oshro. A wealthy man should not pride himself in his wealth. Lo Yisalu Chochem B'Chochmoso. A wise man should not pride himself in his wisdom. Yisalel Odom Yodea Osi. What you should pride yourself is that you know who I am. That's what you should pride yourself. That you've come upon the truth, that you know me, that's what you have, because that's Bechira. Everything is predestined. The only thing which is not predestined, as the Gemara is Tzaddik v'Rosha. Whether you're Tzaddik or Rosha, that's up to us. So there you've utilized, you come upon that, that's what you have the right, because that's what you've achieved, that's what you accomplished. Okay? The first Medrash in Vayikra writes, you know, normally people quote the Chazal, which it is stated that way, but the Chazal here says it differently. Chazal tell us, Kol rodef min hakovod. Person who flees honor, kovod rodef achrov. Person who flees honor pursues that person. The kol bareach min hakov. One who flees honor pursues him. Kol rodef achra kovod. One who pursues honor, kavod rodif borech mimenu. Honor flees that person. That's the way it's normally quoted. However, the Medrash in this week's parsha says it differently. Kol borech min hasroro. Sororo rodif achrov. If you flee from sorora, means being in a dominant position, being in a lording position. You flee not to lord, then lording will come to you. But if you pursue that you want to lord over others, then you will not lord over others. Where do we find this term, soriso? We find that Yaakov, after he defeated the angel, and he had a name change, which was Yisrael, What is the basis of Yisrael? Kisarisa im odav im elokim v'odav v'tucho. You lorded over God, meaning the angel, and Adam, Esav and Lavan, and you were victorious. Sarisa means you lorded over them. You were able to dominate God, meaning the angel, and man. Therefore, that's Yisrael. And that's the Jew. Klal Yisrael, known as Bnei Yisrael, we lord over the world. The world, the value of the world is what was there for us. That's B'Shrili Nivra Olam. And what context did Yaakov establish that? For the sake of Hashem. That's Sarisa. We write it, this week's in the Megillah, it writes that after Vashti, the queen, defied Achashverosh, Haman suggested and advised Achashverosh should send out letters to the whole kingdom that each man should be Sorer B'Beso. He should be the Sorer. He should be the Sar. Sar means like the office of the minister. He should be the minister in his home. He should be the one to lord over his home. That's Soriso. What does it mean? Kola Boreach min hasororo. What does a person want? Why does a person want power? Power means control. That's the ego. It's control. The Maral writes that what is the basis for anger? What is the basis for anger? The basis for anger is gaiva, is arrogance. Why? Because he explains, if you tell somebody to do something and he doesn't listen, why are you upset? You're upset. If I told you, how do you not listen? And if you tell the person the second time and he doesn't listen, that only intensifies your anger. How do you not listen? If I told you, of course you must listen. So it all goes back to the ego. If I tell you, you have to recognize who I am, that I am somebody to be reckoned with. And if you don't value that, that ruffles your feathers. That is the cause of anger. That's the moral of Prague. So I'm saying, so what is it? What does man want to pursue? A position to lord over others. Because what is the persona of the human being? Melech. God is the king. A king rules, dominates. We have that persona. Except the question is, how do you lose it? Do I dominate physical existence for the sake of Hashem? Or do I dominate for my own sake? And that's the challenge. The Torah tells us every male Jew must write a Sefer Torah or own a Sefer Torah through purchasing it. A melech must have two Sefer Torah. He has one which he leaves in his treasury, in his home, and one that he always accompanies him wherever he goes. Why? Because a king is not permitted to waive his honor. A king is the dominant persona in Klal Yisrael. He's not permitted to waive his honor. A person is always in a position, he's not permitted to waive his honor. Over time, what does he begin believing? He believes he is everything. So why does he have Sefer Torah? So the Torah tells us to read it, so he should fear Hashem. That's the reason why the Sefer Torah must always accompany him. So when he's, wherever he is, it's always there for him to read. And what is the value of reading it? The Yerusha es Hashem Elokecha. To revere and fear God, that's the value. That's what it's all about. So over here, Moshe Rabbeinu was Borech min hakavod, min asrora. When Hashem sent him to perform started at the burning bush, he didn't want to take the position to be Goel. He fled from Sororo. Then Hashem says, it's time to take him out of Egypt. After that, after he finished with 10 plagues, he went into retirement. Hashem says, you're not finished yet. We go to Kabbalah Torah, and he brings down the second set of tablets. He's ready to go into retirement. Hashem says, you're not finished. Got to build a Mishkan. After he builds the Mishkan, he wants to go into retirement and go back to his studies. Hashem says, you're not finished yet. You have to teach him about the korbanos, about the sacrifices. So we see from Moshe Rabbeinu, because he was Boreach min Asrora, therefore Srora of Achrov, and therefore it begins Vayikra Hashem el Moshe. And Rashi says the only one who God spoke to directly was Moshe Rabbeinu, no one else. Why? That because he was the one who was But reach mit asrora, therefore srora is what? Was rod v'achrov. Therefore srora, this concept of lording, being in a kingly position, having ultimate majesty, pursued him because his persona is Hashem's persona. Because everything he did was for the sake of Hashem. That's the concept. There's a concept known as Mishtamesh B'Sharvito Shel Melech. A commoner is not permitted to use the scepter of the king, because the scepter of the king is only for the king. So the Ramban writes in the Geras HaRamban, in the letter about arrogance. We say one of the chapters of Tehillim, we say on Shabbos, Hashem Geus Lovesh. God is cloaked in Geus. What's Geus? Geus comes from the word Gaiva. It means exaltedness, pompousness. Because God is king. Hashem Moloch, God is Moloch, he reigns. Geus Lovesh, he's cloaked in Geus. If a person behaves like a Balgaiva, with arrogance, with pompousness, we say a person's arrogant is Tovas Hashem. God sees it as an abomination. Why? Because what are you using? Where do you have a right to behave in this pompous way where you're only a commoner? That majesty and that cloak of control, all this, that's for Hashem, that's not for you. Therefore, it's considered Mishtamshim Sharvito Shel Melech. It's like using the scepter of the king. If you go and display who you are because you're representing Hashem, you are the ambassador to the world as God's representative as something else. But if you're an independent, and you display that arrogance, who you display that arrogance? Tovas Hashem kol gov alev. The Navi says, Tovas Hashem. It's an abomination of God if you have this elevated heart. We read Pirkei Avos. If you studied enormous amount of Torah, do not pride yourself. Why? Because you were created exactly that purpose. That's the same challenge. Do I have a right to pride myself? Or that's what you're supposed to do? I'm doing it because God said I'm supposed to do it. That's my value. That's the purpose of my existence. Okay. Vayikra el Moshe. Vayidaber Hashem elav me'ol moed le'emor. And he called to Moshe, and Hashem spoke to him from the communion tent, saying, Rashi, Vayikra el Moshe, L'chol dibros, chol amiros, chol tzivuyim, kodmo kriyo. Whenever we find and God spoke, he first called to him, and then he spoke. So we find every communication is predicated on he called. Vayikro vayidaber. Vayikro vayomar. He called him, then he spoke to him, or he said to him. Why? Loshen chibo. It's an expression of love. Loshen shemalchei asheros mishtamshem bo. It's an expression which the angels speak to one another when they communicate. As it says, V'kora zel zeh v'omar. Right? So we say, they called to one another and they said, Aval nevi'u b'sa'olam. But to the prophets of the world, Niglo aleim b'loshen aroi v'tuma. Shenema v'yikor. What's the yikor? V'yikor elokim al bilam. It's an expression of mikre. To indicate, it's like happenstance. It's like, I'll give you an example. Somebody overhears a conversation. It's like you're hearing it because it's within your earshot. With Moshe Rabbeinu, it's Vayikro. He called him to indicate that this is specifically for you, an introduction to what we're going to speak about. Dumas Olam, there's no introduction. He wanted they should be aware of certain information. So it's like it was within your earshot, that's why you heard it. But not that it was direct, to indicate there's not the direct relationship. Vayikra Moshe, Hakol Holech Magil Oznov, Chol Yisrael Lo Shomim. The level of audibility, the voice of Hashem travels, and it only reaches the ears of Moshe Rabbeinu, and nobody hears it other than Moshe. Yochol Aflav Sokas Hoysa Kriyo. Maybe even for the pauses, there was a Kriyo. He says, now we're going to pause. Tabaloma v'yidaber. L'dibur hoysa Kriyo v'lo v'avsokos. For when Hashem was going to communicate something, it says he called him to indicate, I'm about to start speaking. But when there were the pauses, which was time for Moshe Rabbeinu to reflect on what was said, Hashem didn't say, now there's time to reflect. What was the value of the pauses between the communications? Give Moshe time to reflect from one parsha to the next parsha, and one subject matter to the other. There's no question. An ordinary person learns from an ordinary person. When you hear something, you have to stop and you have to reflect to be able to absorb and understand what was just communicated to you. That's very interesting. Very often, like sometimes taken aback, sometimes I think, and even that when I say something, my own insight, I quote something, whether it's an Orach Chaim HaKodesh, whether it's the Gemara, whether it's the Maral, and the people should be overwhelmingly impressed. And people say, Rabbi, I understand it. It sounds good. Sounds good. If you'd reflect on it and understand how profound it is, you'd be totally consumed with it. So why aren't you consumed? I hear what you're saying. You present lahavdil, a deal. It's one of a kind of deal. And the person says, I get deals all day long. The person says to him, you're not paying attention. If you do your due diligence on this deal, you'll understand it's one of a kind of a deal. So you have to reflect on it and do your analysis to appreciate what it is. So it's not enough just to hear. When Hashem communicated the Torah to him, it was communicated in its totality. But you're a human being. To be able to get the import and the effect and all the profoundness of it, you have to reflect as a human being. There's a famous Rabbeinu Yonah in Pirkei Avos right at the beginning. It says, Shimon HaTzadik, who's Mishyorei Knesset Gadol, said three things. One of the things he says, having Mesunim B'din. Remember the Mishnah, it's the beginning of Pirkei Avos. Having Mesunim B'din. You should be deliberate in judgment. What does deliberate in judgment mean? I mean, when the Bezdin, when the Sanhedrin, before they render a decision, you should be Mesunim. You should do it with deliberateness. So the Rabbeinu writes, as intelligent as you are, the reality of human being is, initially we come upon something and we believe it's correct. And when you reflect on it slightly, you realize it's not imperfect. It's not as perfect as initially you thought. You find there's certain flaws and then you refine it. That's the reality of a person. So the first initial impression is not always correct. As a result of that, a person who's wise knows you have to keep reflecting. And the more you reflect, the more you come to the conclusion that this is correct. Otherwise, it's not always correct, because first impressions, always we believe it to be right, but it may not be right. That's having Mesunim B'din. You take a look at Rabbeinu Yonah, to read his words. You have to have reflection. Vayikra, and then this pauses. Vayikra v'yidaber, then the pauses. Because without the pause, even Hashem is the communicator. He's communicating to you. Nobody could communicate it in such an absolute context, so succinctly. No aspect of it is left unclear. But as a human being, we have to reflect. He says, if Hashem is communicating it, and you need a reflection, that you need that pause. Definitely from a commoner to a commoner, where the communication from the communicator is not as absolute and total, and the capacity of the two people are limited. No question, you have to reflect to have an appreciation for what it is. The Rambam Pas rules in Hilchos Talmud Torah, it's based on a Mishnah Pirkei Avos, that if a Rebbe teaches Torah and the student asks a question on what was taught, the Rebbe should not be impatient. Why? Because the student has a right to say to the Rebbe, if he is impatient, I'm only asking to understand the Torah. That's why I'm asking, because otherwise I'm wasting that time. Not everybody has the ability to grasp something fully the first time, or even to grasp it whatsoever. And the person says, Torah, I need tzarech lumod. I want to study Torah. That's why I'm asking the question. And the Gemara, that's why the akaptin melamed. If a person has a short fuse, is impatient, you shouldn't be in the teaching business. Because you have to understand that everybody doesn't understand something immediately. And not only don't you understand it immediately, the way one says it, sometimes you need reflection, and to refine the understanding was just communicated, you have to ask the question to come to the truth of whatever was just said. But that's the Vayikra. Vayikra was for the Vayadaber. He called, I'm about to say something. So you have to be attentive. And I want you to be attentive, to have the full import of what I'm communicating. But after that, you have to reflect to be a beneficiary of what was communicated. Mishnah tells us in Brachos that the Hasidim Rishonim, the original Hasidim, they would spend an hour preparing to say the Amidah. And it took them an hour to say the Shemon Esrei. And after they finished the Shemon Esrei, they would spend another hour. So an hour in preparation, an hour in the actual tefillah, and an hour afterwards. Now the question is, hour in preparation, we understand. Person's going to have an audience with a very special king. And to be able to be fully prepared to present your request or supplication to the king, you have to think about what you're going to say. Every word, how you're going to say, what you're going to say, what you're going to request. So that takes an hour. Now, when you make the request, since you're standing before the ultimate, you articulate it also with deliberateness, and with the appropriate mindset. But afterwards, after you finish, you walk away. So what was the hour after? Sha'achat tefillah. And they did this 3 times a day. So the Gemara says it was 9 hours a day. 9 hours a day, they would invest in just the Shemon Esrei. The Hasidim Rishonim. What was the hour afterwards? So the way it's explained, these Hasidim Rishonim, when they stood before them, they had that audience with Hashem, they were touched to such a profound level. It was an experience. To be able to be a beneficiary of that experience, they had to reflect on what that experience was, and only then did they have the full impact and import of what that experience was. But that's the reflection. That's the Sha'achat Tefillah. So the Gemara asks, if they were busy 9 hours a day with the Amidah, and the person has to sleep, and you have other things to do, when do you have time to study? When do you have time to earn a living? 9 hours is very substantial time. So Gemara says, because they were Hasidim Rishonim, when they would study, they would retain it easily. They wouldn't have to review much. Their parnosa, their livelihood came easily to them. Hashem provided it because they were Hasidim, because they were at that special level with Hashem. All the lack of clarity had no application to them because of the degree of intimacy they had with Hashem. Hashem allowed them to come upon the truth quickly, whether it was Torah, whether it was to provide for their livelihood, everything came easily to them, almost effortless, because they were Hasidim Rishonim. But what was the Sha'achat Tefillah? That's the equivalent of the pause, to reflect and to have the full effect of whatever that was. God spoke to him. What's the inference to him? Means to him and no one else. This is very important. Lamarit is Aaron. This comes to exclude Aaron. He spoke to him and not to Aaron. We're talking about the directness. This is specifically speaking about the Torah. I mean, every Navi, Hashem speaks to the Navi. But in terms of the Torah, the only one Hashem communicated Torah to was to Moshe Rabbeinu, to no one else. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir Omer, Yud Gimel Dibros Nemru B'Torah LeMoshe UlAaron. We find 13 times the word Veidaber. It says Veidaber Hashem El Moshe El Aaron. 13 times it's mentioned. Uchenegdo Nemru Yud Gimel Miutin. And corresponding to those 13, we have 13 inferences to exclude Aaron. Lelamdoch, what does that to teach us? Shlo la'Aaron nemru el Moshe sheyomer la'Aaron. It means it's to elucidate that it was not it was directly to Aaron, but rather it was said to Moshe that Aaron should be the first recipient of that communication. Where do we find 13 exclusions? Ledaber ito. Hashem spoke ito. Medaber elov. Vedaber elov. Arti lecho. Kulan b'toras kohanim. They're all mentioned toras kohanim. Yochol shomo es kol akri. Maybe they heard when Hashem spoke to Moshe. Other people heard. Talmud lomar kolo. The voice of Hashem was only to him. Kolo kol elov. Moshe Shama, Chol Yisrael Shamu. You understand? Again, we find over here, Alan, this is important. It says 13 times. 13 times it says, Veidaber Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron, and we have 13 miutim, 13 exclusions. Why the number 13? As we said many times, 13 is Echod. Echod represents, this is Hashem's presence related to Moshe. That echod at that level was only to Moshe, to no one else. Therefore, it's elov, or it's low. So what does it say? V'daber Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron. That's for Moshe to communicate to Aaron that he's the first recipient of that communication. You know, we find very often, Rashi cites Chazal, that sometimes Moshe precedes Aaron, and Aaron precedes Moshe. What do we learn from that? Sheshkulim hoyu, that they were equal standing. Moshe and Aaron, in a certain aspect of who they were equal. And therefore, sometimes the Torah mentions Moshe first in the pasuk, and sometimes Aaron. It doesn't mean they were at the same level. I mean, Moshe was the only human being ever to experience a prophecy face to face in a wake state. Aaron not. It means there was a certain aspect. Hashem valued Aaron. Aaron was not spiritualized to the degree of Moshe. But in terms of his standing, Hashem's love for him was similar to the love that he had for Moshe. They were within the same realm. And therefore, the first communication to receive what Hashem communicated to Moshe, who was the first one to receive that? That's V'daber Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aaron. So we have the 13 exclusions, inferences, only Moshe to indicate means he's the first recipient of that communication. Why he the first? Because he's the most special. Because Aaron is the most special. Therefore, he's the first one to receive that communication.
Rabbi, could you say that they were equal?
Hashem spoke to Moshe. The only one who heard it was Elov. No one else heard it. Maybe because it was lacking in audibility. It was like in a whisper. We'll see in a moment. Rashi says, the sound, the voice was not heard outside the communion tent. Maybe because the sound of the voice was low. The kol. What would it be? The sound, the voice. Ma'akol, hu akol, I'm furish b'tilim. It's the sound which is mentioned in Tilim. Kol Hashem b'koach. The voice of Hashem is with power. Kol Hashem b'hodor, in splendor. Kol Hashem shover rozim. The voice of Hashem smashes the cedars. Okay, lomanem e'omoid. Mlamicha kol nifsak. Kyotzi b'kol kanfi akruvim. Okay. Now the question is this. At Sinai, it says the voice of Hashem was heard by the millions of people who were there. So of course, you have to have that level of audibility for the people to hear it. But it says the call which Hashem communicated to Moshe was the call which is Shomer HaRozin. It's the ultimate level of audibility. But if he's only communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu, what do we need that level of audibility? Right? Let it be a lesser decibels. Why this unlimited level, this intense, overwhelming, powerful sound? The Ramban had said earlier that the Mishkan was a replication of Sinai. Meaning the Mishkan itself, when Moshe received it, whatever communication that Hashem had given to Moshe, it was the equivalent of us hearing it at Sinai. So at Sinai, what was the level of audibility? It's called Hashem Shomer HaRozin. That's what it was. At Sinai, when every Jew heard the voice of Hashem, did the Goyim hear the voice of Hashem? No. It says the Jews prophesied. The nations of the world had no idea. They knew the world was quaking. They had no idea what that quaking was all about. There they needed some kind of explanation, which was given by Bilam. But the Goyim had no idea what it was, the nations of the world. Only the Jews. So that means every Jew individually heard Kol Hashem B'Koach. But why? Because when the Torah was given, that is the expression of Hashem. You have a sense of who Hashem is. That's the way to. So therefore, any Torah that was communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu was that same level of audibility, because that's the equivalent of Kabbalah Torah. As Sinai was receiving the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu Shokol connected Yisrael. He's the equivalent of the total Jewish people. When Torah is communicated to him, it's literally a Sinai event, and therefore it's that same level of audibility which Hashem had communicated to at Sinai was to Moshe Rabbeinu. Same idea.
Rabbi, when we have in the Gemara, oh, this is Halacha Moshe Messina, is that this? Is that what we're talking about?
No. Everything is Halacha Moshe Sinai.